And are we on?
Test.
Yes, excellent. And yes, I do look at my chat logs, Ernest. So hello, everybody. President Sunday here. I'm joined today by Shruggie, who is halfway through his PhD in philosophy. Was there anything else you wanted to say about yourself before we go in?
That's what I'm doing. I'm also a long-time lurker on various Discords and YouTube comment threads. Some people might recognize my little avatar. I recognize some people.
On what kind of Discords and online threads?
Well, I guess I dipped my toes into some of these reactionary circles for a time.
Was the water cold?
Yeah. How do I describe the water? It was salty. I guess, I don't know. I sort of, it was kind of benign at the beginning, and then it got pretty sharply cold pretty recently. I think I was defending you too much.
What?
So I was branded your accomplice, and so that got me booted from at least one. I don't think I need to name names, but
no. But I think we vindicated them today.
Sorry, who did we vindicate?
Whoever is calling you my accomplice. You are now the third blessed guest of the rare and privileged few who managed to go onto this particular stream. Okay, so anyways, now I've completely derailed myself. So I think the plan for this was just to sort of get us going. We were going to look at a video by Endeavor called Lies of the Enlightenment. We were just going to comment on that on the first episode, just to sort of give us sort of a launching point, because I really have no idea where even to begin with this whole topic. So, and then after that, we'll take questions from the chat, and we'll just sort of go from there.
And bloviate at will.
And bloviate at will, exactly.
All right.
All right. So, hold on to your butts. Here we go.
That's right, DD. Philosophy. Sorry.
Can everybody hear this? Can everybody hear the video when that's running? That beautiful chime at the beginning. Can you hear that? How are we? Some confirmation? Okay, I'm just going to assume we're good. All right.
The Enlightenment, the intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries, which would form the philosophical basis for liberalism, the political system which has remained dominant in the West for the past 3 centuries.
This is kind of a weird sentence right off the bat. So, correct me if I'm wrong. My periodization isn't good, but the Enlightenment generally refers to 17th century onward, right?
I mean, I think something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not an early modern philosophy expert, but
right. Yeah. Okay. I guess you can sort of generally say that sort of is generative of liberalism. I would have gone a little bit further. This is when liberalism is first being sort of formed, right? So I don't know. But let's
depends what you mean.
Depends what you mean. Let's keep going.
Okay.
The ideas adopted from the Enlightenment, such as liberty, reason, democracy, and secularism, to this day largely form the basis of what the West considers to be good and just. A liberal today might make the claim that the values of the Enlightenment have endured the test of time. After all, the West is as wealthy, advanced, and safe as it has ever been. But for someone who looks behind all the economic prosperity and technological development to see a deeper societal sickness that threatens the West, one must consider the metaphysical basis of the society in which these problems developed. Because the conception of the individual, the state, and society handed down from the Enlightenment are largely used to legitimize the power structure under which the West is governed today. But if we are seeing a breakdown of our societal narrative, which I believe we are, questions will need to be answered. I've spent the last few months reading texts from famous Enlightenment thinkers and their defenders. I've spent some time reflecting upon these ideas and how they hold up today. And I am of the belief that the worldview advanced by the Enlightenment is incapable of answering the questions that will arise in our modern era. That is why I believe a real critique of the Enlightenment is needed, because I am convinced the Enlightenment...
Okay, I forgot exactly how he put it.
We can
What
rewind
are
it.
the questions? What are the questions that are going to face us going forward? How do you put that? That's like 5 seconds back. Can we?
Yeah, sure. Let's look at that.
Of answering the questions that will arise in our modern era.
Okay,
That is why
the questions that will arise in our modern era. What do we think those might be? What are the problems that we want to try to solve? That's a good question.
Okay. Do we want to canvas some, or do you want us to keep going?
Well, I mean, does anything leap to mind for you? How would you I mean, and it's forward looking. It's not the problems right now, even. It's the problems that will arise. So, I mean, everyone should care about that. So, what sort of things are we facing? Maybe we should let him. I haven't watched this whole video, so
maybe in a second. Something does immediately come to mind, though, and it's something I've touched on in a few of my videos, actually. When people talk about the modern state, they tend to treat it as if it's this undifferentiated thing. Like there was a certain period in which the modern state arose. Some people point to beginning of the 20th century. Some people point to the Peace of Westphalia, which is as fuzzy as you can get. But it's really within that bubble of quote unquote the modern state. There's a massive amount of differentiation and variety. And even in the past 100 years, long after really any pre-Enlightenment or even Enlightenment thinker is long dead, you're looking at a situation in which we have an unprecedented degree of interconnectivity. And I mean, old notions of state sovereignty more or less don't even apply anymore. John Locke, for example, didn't have to deal with a global economy, not anywhere near in the sense that we're talking about now. Yeah, there was interstate trade. There was overseas shipping, but it was at no point was the power of a state entirely determined by its economic relationship with its neighbors, and its borders were not pressed cheek to cheek with every other state. Like there were divisions in kinds of land. There was Terra Nova, there was Free Sea, these are called Carl Schmitt's divisions. But long story short, the sort of political order that obtains today had no precedent back to when these people were writing. So when people talk about retrieving political principles from these old thinkers, like you have to be extremely modest with what you're saying you can do there. That's just one. I know one that's really close to your area of study, artificial intelligence.
Oh yeah.
Or bioethics. Like maybe you want to comment on that.
Well, I don't know when we'll resume this video if I start commenting on that, but that's probably okay.
Oh, it's fine. We got a couple of hours free.
Well, I guess there's a more general thing that could be said before I get into that, and that's, there's this sort of cliche phrase, modern problems require modern solutions, and so if you're a reactionary, you don't like modern solutions, but I think everybody needs to acknowledge that the problems that need to be solved are modern problems. So maybe if we can reach deep into the past and recover,
if I may, just for clarification, by modern problems, you mean not perennial problems?
Yeah, or perennial problems as they're expressed under our material, social, political conditions, depending on how you want to look at it. But I mean, with artificial intelligence, right? Okay, so this hasn't really okay. So, do you want me to get into like what I'm working on? Because that's gonna
by all means, that'd be fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Right. So I'm interested in this notion of a person building project. So this would be an attempt to create beings that have the capacities that make human persons persons. So there is a modern discipline called artificial intelligence. They don't seem to be trying to create persons. It's an engineering discipline. They're making great leaps and strides, and they can solve a lot of problems. But as far as I can tell, nobody is directly, expressly trying to work on creating beings that, for instance, so what is it about us that makes us persons? Like, what features of ourselves matter such that if you created something with those features, it would be a person in the same sense you are, and it would have the same moral standing as you do, and it would be, a candidate for a member of a political society like you do. Well, okay, so one of them is, so it doesn't matter that we have 10 fingers, right? If I lost a finger, I would still be a person. But there are attributes.
you.
Sorry?
I said, says you. Keep going.
Some may disagree, but I think that's remarkable. But yeah, so I mean, what are the things about us that matter to our personhood, to our status as personhood? Well, among other things, we're the sorts of beings who care about things. We experience sort of events in the world. We experience our relationships with other people as things that matter, and these direct and guide our life pursuits. They basically, there's a whole sort of projectable pattern of emotions that you have when you care about something. So if somebody threatens somebody or something you care about, you'll feel defensive. You'll possibly have anger or indignation at the thing that's threatening the things you care about. So if you were to try to engage in a person building project, you would be trying to make something like that, something that cared about things, something to whom things and persons in the world mattered. So that's just one attribute. I could list a bunch of other ones. They're not things that are really discussed in AI literature. People talk a lot about artificial general intelligence. It's basically instrumental reasoning. It's basically the problem solving. It's like, give it a problem, it finds a way to solve it. So, you know, there's like some sort of, so right now there's a lot of buzz about deep learning. These are systems that are good at, for instance, classifying images. So basically, a standard sort of supervised learning paradigm would have you have this system that basically you feed it a bunch of data with labels, and it learns what they sometimes call a representation, which lets you give it new images, and it will predict whether or not that the label, it'll basically try to assign a label from the data set to it.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's not really talking about things that would matter vis-a-vis personhood, right? Like that's cool, that's important. We can do that.
Well, just to interfere there, I mean, your concerns in this area, specifically with personhood, this is actually drawing on older philosophy.
Oh, I mean, so one question I'm concerned about with this, so I'm interested in defining this project, right? Or defining what a person building project would amount to, but I'm also interested in ethical questions that it raises. And in particular, are there good reasons to engage in a person building project? And what would those be? And what would be bad reasons? So, and
you've gotten pushback on that, but strange pushback. I've read a few of the things that people were responding with, and they, I think you were in a Thomas Discord where you were talking about this very topic, and I think the general response was, rather than to try and sort of creatively or address the problem on its own terms, they would just say something to the effect of, "This can't be done."
Yeah, right. So I mean, this is not a this is like a non-problem to, and this didn't happen once. This happens every time I sort of try to raise this topic in circles like this. I mean, so you asked the question, what would be a good reason to try to create an artificial person? And the answer is, well, that's impossible. Well, that's nonsense. I mean, so on
rather spurious ground. So it seems to be that it has to do with some conception of the soul that is sort of orthodox. This is something that you can't that can't be emergent from an artificial construction or from a man-made construction. Which I mean, maybe that's true, but do we know that? And if we don't know that with certainty, can we just throw that under the rug, given that there are active projects to try and create exactly that kind of thing?
So the thing, well, yeah, the thing is, this has never been a possible active project at any other time in history. So when Aquinas is writing about, you know, the soul and its faculties, this sort of thing is not in anyone's imagination. Nobody's supposing for a second that we could create beings like ourselves. But that's, I mean, that was kind of waiting on, among other things, technological developments, which wouldn't happen for a very long time. But now that it's starting to look like we can actually start thinking about this, we have kinds of technologies that could enable us to engage in something like this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think it's a live problem and certainly a live possibility. And just by historical contingency, it just hasn't looked that way. And it certainly hasn't been a question anybody's been trying to solve. But now that it's coming up, this is a modern ethical problem and indeed a political problem. I mean, imagine that you succeed at this. There will now be persons who are brought into existence. For what purpose? So the thing is, what is the existing economic incentive for creating, for AI right now?
Well, I mean, here's an interesting ethical thing that was brought to my attention recently by a very smart friend of mine. Isn't it interesting that it seems that the motivation for creating AI is the same impetus that gave us slaves?
Well, exactly. I mean, the term robot, that's kind of, now, this is something I was told. I don't actually.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the exact. I've been told that too. I don't know the exact etymology there. I think it might mean it might mean specifically laborer, not slave. Let me look that up. Actually, I'm kind of curious. Keep going with what you were saying, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, so if people are going to engage in these kinds of intense research efforts, they're probably going to need a lot of money. Who's going to give them that money? Like, how are they going to? What's in it for people to engage in this? Under some aspects, intellectual project. Well, okay. People already are interested in companionship robots. There are sex robots. I mean, I know as much about this as I need to, given that I'm studying people trying to create artificial person-like beings. Of course, automation is already taking over a great deal of sectors of labor, but I mean, yeah, just in general, if you could create something which had the capacities we have, I mean, imagine, for instance, that you could create an artificial system that cared about your nation or your home, your household, like it cared about you, like literally, and so it acted in ways that are rational. If you care about something, it would take precautions. It would pay careful attention to possible threats. There are a lot of reasons why it would be very useful for militaries to have this kind of technology. So, I mean, the problem is all of these reasons are basically questions of what can they do for us? How can we put them to work? But if you're creating things with the capacities that make us persons, then you're bringing into being persons for the express purpose of making them do work for you. Are you going to treat them like persons? So I think,
if I may, on the flip side, if you now have sort of an established capacity to create persons on some par with sort of natural born persons as we understand them today, that could also lend to a depreciation of those.
Say more.
Well, just in the sense that if human beings are now equivalent in some essential respect with an artificial creation, we could lose. I don't want to be too bold in what I'm suggesting here, but it could lend to sort of a depreciating of the exceptional nature that we tend to ascribe to human beings, because the whole sort of Kantian notion of we have a moral imperative to treat human beings as ends rather than means. Well, as soon as we start creating human beings for the purpose of being means, I mean, I could very easily see if people become accustomed to treating things that are basically like humans in some really important capacities as purely utensils, as utilities.
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, that would bleed over. I'm almost certain it would.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying, and this is something that's going to come up. Well, if we can create persons, if we understand what personal capacities are so much that we can create beings that instantiate them, well, maybe that shows that we're not so special. But see, I want to take the opposite direction. I want to say, well, here's our problem. We think that in virtue of us being the productive causes of these things, somehow they matter less. They're less important. They're less real. I think what we actually need to do is elevate the status of these possible beings we would create. I mean, we're saying that they are, insofar as personhood is special. Well, these are persons, so they're as special as us, like full stop. So, they would deserve rights. They would deserve to be members of political communities. It's kind of interesting, so we were just talking about how this idea kind of gets shut down in Thomist circles. But I mean,
ostensibly Thomist circles.
Thomists, but what these people don't realize is that they're heirs of an intellectual tradition that actually has resources to help us answer this question.
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean? I mean, so the monotheistic traditions have had to deal with this question. Why did God create human persons? Why did he need to? Because we know on these traditions that God is all powerful, so it's not like he needs slaves or workers. We know that he's all knowing, so he's not engaged in some kind of scientific simulation for his own knowledge or benefit. He's self-sufficient, so he doesn't need relationships with anyone. But he's also all good, so whatever his reasons are, they have to be good reasons. So why would he do it? Well, actually, people have spent time thinking about this, and I think we should think about the reasons that they gave as we engage in these projects. And the answers people have tended to give have been something like, well, it was a kind of our creation, the creation of human persons, was a kind of gift. It was an act of love, kind of an act of, and we have to understand love as a sort of overflow. So, there's one sort of Greek notion of love, which is kind of, it's a response to some worthiness in the beloved, right? So you love something because it's beautiful, or you love someone because they're virtuous or something. But then there's another notion of love, which you could call agape, which kind of originates in the Christian tradition, where you have to understand love as being this kind of freely given overflow thing. So it tells you about the character of the creator, and it's just given freely. It's unconditional, just given freely. And so the traditional answers are that God created humans as a kind of gift to them, out of a kind of proleptic or forward-looking love for them. So, I mean, I just want to suggest that if we're going to think seriously about bringing into being more persons, a race, an artificial race of persons, maybe we should consider adopting that kind of stance ourselves. Because if we do that, then every move we make will be done with their flourishing, their well-being in mind, right? Yeah. Like this is going to ensure that as we're engaging in this project, we are guided so that they will be brought into a world that they can do okay in.
I'm both glad and torn that I brought you on, Shruggie, because I have to say, I feel like I'm committing a philosophical crime by reorienting the discussion to political reaction.
I did warn you. I did say.
I think that was honestly, what pains me is that this is way more interesting than anything else we're going to see in this video. And I have to say, thank you to Endeavor for making this. Think of how much we've gotten out of 1 minute of this video.
Well, I mean, we could do whatever we want. There's a lot of chat. I haven't looked at any of it.
I'm actually happy to continue on the current stream, but we can. That's something we should go back just to sort of just to justify this video being on the screen.
Okay.
But we can. I'm not sure there are questions as such.
Well, okay. Maybe I'll just sum that up in a way that is actually relevant.
Please, by all means, yeah.
So I mean, we have this intellectual heritage, which people have poured their lives into working through hard problems and trying to come up with answers that are responsible. And that's so insofar as reactionaries are thinking that, there's this valuable cultural, political, religious, etc. heritage that they don't want to be lost and that they see encroachments upon. There's some good to that, right? Like there's some good stuff to recover, but I think, yeah, there's definitely a way I wanted to wrap that up, but I think
that's okay.
That. But I don't know. So I guess I can just say that is good. That's a good thing. That's a good impulse. But what that's going to look like is you're going to go back into that past and you're going to do this reading and you're going to learn the lessons. And then you're going to take those lessons and you're going to turn them to the problems we're facing now. And we inhabit a different world now. I mean, as this video said, technologically, societally, politically, it's a very different place. So how are we going to apply the spirit of these lessons that took so much effort to generate to the problems we face now? And they're different problems. Yeah. So that's the challenge, and that's a challenge I think all of us, we should draw from the past, but we should be looking at the problems we face now and trying to answer them.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I would just add I just wanted to add as well to that. And we can't make use of those things effectively if we're treating them as sort of a sanctuary to retreat from modernity from.
No, we don't want to retreat. We want to face this head on. I mean, we're in it. You can't retreat. You can't go back in time.
Yeah. All right, shall we get back to what we came here to do ostensibly?
Sure.
All right. So, modern questions. Let's keep going.
Okay.
I believe a real critique of the Enlightenment is needed, because I am convinced the Enlightenment is incapable of leading the West forward. This will be the first in another series of ongoing videos I'll be releasing on this channel titled Lies of the Enlightenment. Each video will focus on one idea from the Enlightenment and the various authors that advance this idea. I will attempt to hold these ideas up to scrutiny and ask, do they ring true about the nature of man, or are they false and preventing us from understanding the societal illness that afflicts the West today? And this first video will strike head-on at the biggest lie of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment itself. The idea that through reason and intellect, man can morally evolve as a creature. That there was this one point in the 18th century where something just clicked in the heads of men like Voltaire or Rousseau, as if they were struck by an epiphany from the secular ghost of liberalism, and they figured out how we can fundamentally improve the nature of man.
Okay, just as I want to comment on that briefly. That really annoyed me, that particular section. It annoyed me for this reason. It conflates Enlightenment as was thought by Enlightenment thinkers with the period called the Enlightenment, and these aren't the same thing at all. So the concept of Enlightenment doesn't entail that there was a point in time when there was a bolt from the blue and just a bunch of these European thinkers suddenly figured out progress and what have you. These forms of thinking were continuous with older philosophy. They directly reference it. If you read Kant, he is making a response to Thomists, to Aristotle, what have you. Like it's yeah. But
well, what's funny about this is, what is it to have practical wisdom, to use this rational part of the soul to Aristotle? Well, it's to know what the good for man is, right? Like, the more wisdom that you have, the more you're using the rational part of the soul, the more you know not only what is good for man, but the more you can do political science, right? You could speak to that. But
well, I just see that we have Professor Bates in the chat, so hopefully he has something to say.
Oh, I bet.
So be careful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I deferred to you when we got to the politics, but
yeah. I'm actually hesitant to say anything now. Let's continue.
And I believe that this is the ultimate falsehood of the Enlightenment. The idea that Western man ever became enlightened, or that he ever could. That today we fundamentally have advanced beyond our nature to achieve a higher ethical state. The entire narrative of the Enlightenment is that it led Europe past the so-called Dark Ages, and since then we've continued to make progress towards more freedom, more equality, more enlightenment. Progressivism is an ideology based on this very principle, progress. And the conception of modern Western society that it gives us is that we're advanced past our ancestors, and that we can overcome the various ills which have caused conflict in the past through reason and education. This is foolish, naive, and dangerous.
Is it?
I zoned out. There was something I wanted to say at the beginning, and then I zoned out.
Okay. Let's keep going.
Okay.
This is, oh, God.
I was trying to read the chat. That's what I was doing.
Oh, big mistake.
Okay, I'm reading it. All right.
Yeah.
Let's continue.
Yeah, let's continue. Okay, do you want me to rewind quickly, or do you want? Let's keep going. Just keep going.
There was something I wanted to say.
Okay, let's go back 10 seconds. I'm so sorry, chat. This is all Shruggie's fault.
Today, we fundamentally have advanced beyond our nature to achieve a higher ethical state. The entire narrative of the Enlightenment is that it led Europe past the so-called Dark Ages, and since then we've continued to make progress towards more freedom, more equality, more enlightenment. Progressivism is an ideology based on this very principle, progress. And the conception of modern Western society that it gives us is that we're advanced past our ancestors, and that we can overcome the various ills which have caused conflict in the past through reason and education. This is foolish, naive, and dangerous.
Sorry, yeah, go on.
So it's like it's one Whig history against I don't know. Like, yes, there's a bad telling of the history of, I don't even know what category to use.
Well, here's something that comes to my mind. If you actually understood sort of Kant's notion of progress, and indeed enlightenment, this isn't it. The notion is never that we can just sort of talk to each other and teach each other and we'll get smarter as a result. Kant has this concept called in English anyways, I don't know what the actual German is, but the unsocial sociability of men. And this predates, does it predate? My timelines are bad here, but long story short, what he's proposing is essentially social Darwinism. So his argument is this: human beings contest with each other in an increasingly globalized world. He doesn't use his language, but increasingly globalized world. People come into economic conflict with each other, and they have to be more inventive than each other. They have to be more X, Y, and Z in order to make it. And as a result, there's a constant raising of the bar in terms of how technically advanced we are, how sophisticated we are philosophically, what have you, in order to survive. And I don't think this is easy to object to, because it's borne out in reality. We are massively more sophisticated than we were back then. Massively. I mean, people complain about modern philosophy versus sort of the rigor that you see in quote unquote classical philosophy or in medieval philosophy.
Who does that?
Well, Endeavor would, I would imagine. But I mean, generally, you see a disparagement of modern philosophy as if it was all sort of equivalent with the stuff that you would see called sort of postmodern drivel, the stuff that kind of takes like not actually postmodern, but philosophy that does sloppy work pursuant to a political goal. Usually associated with the left wing, but you see it on the right as well. And that's not true. If you actually look at modern, like actual philosophy as done by philosophers, is incredibly rigorous and requires a lot of background reading to get into. I think one of the reasons why there's this perception of medieval philosophy and classical philosophy being inherently better than contemporary philosophy, and I'm not going to disagree that there's probably more profit in reading it than a lot of modern philosophy for most people, but one of the reasons is that it's bluntly just easier to access to the layperson who's not in philosophy. So they're just more aware of it. And the stuff that is accessible to laypersons in philosophy that's contemporary, well, there's a reason for that. It's not cutting edge. It's specifically geared towards people who aren't philosophers. But
I don't know though. I think people are writing good stuff. I think people are writing great stuff like today, and they were 100 years ago, and they were 100
yeah,
years before that. I think these generalizations. I don't know. I don't hear people studying philosophy making them. Uh, I hear people in sort of reactionary online communities saying it. Um, I mean, there is a sense in which, yeah, they're okay. So a lot more gets written. You know, there's a lot more ink spilled, and you know the bar has been the bar to entry, I suppose, has been lowered. You know, there are good journals and there are not so good journals. Lots and lots and lots of books get published. So okay, there is more lower quality stuff out there, but I mean, I don't know. It's not like people just stopped writing great books. I
Mm.
mean, no, maybe we could have as a whole separate discussion
yeah,
ways in which academic philosophy in the 21st century is kind of more mundane or more ultra specialized. We could do that, but
Mhm.
I mean, even like 100 years ago, people used to write in a much more grandiose style, which doesn't necessarily mean it's more substantive. But I don't know. I just think if people would read like I don't know William James or something, they'd be like, oh yeah, that's actually that's some great stuff.
Mhm.
But anyways,
Yeah, and his student Peirce, I'm supposed to be getting into soon, who, again, very clever friend of mine, suggests would be the next Kant if he had been taken up by the Academy as he should have been.
yeah, I just started getting into Peirce.
That's
Sometimes more
P-E-I-R.
accessible, sometimes not. But sorry,
I was just telling you the chat. That's P-E-I-R-C-E.
right? Yeah, I always spell it wrong, but yeah.
It looks like Pierce, but it's not Pierce. Which is a shame because he deserves the name Pierce over the name Peirce. But
Yeah.
I'm going to I'm just going to excuse myself for 10 seconds. I just have to deal with something quick, and I'll be right back. Okay with that?
Sure, I'll
You
read
can
that.
you can answer the chat if you want.
Sure.
Feel free.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
Okay, chat. How far back do I go? Never done this. I'll look for a question mark. Okay. Are there current political philosophers daring enough to abandon liberal foundations? Daring enough to abandon. Okay, so I don't do political philosophy per se. I've taken some coursework in it, but that's not my area of specialization. Abandon liberal foundations. I wonder what you mean by liberal foundations. I mean, I imagine the answer is going to be yes, no matter what you mean by that question. But yeah. Any thoughts on race and IQ? I don't care, but that's just me. I mean, I could generate thoughts if I felt like it. What else? How much technology do we need to survive? Ooh. Are the majority of humans mentally capable of living fulfilling lives with highly sophisticated technological societies? Well, I mean, you can kind of imagine societies that are, habitable for everyone and those that aren't. It could really go, it could go in any direction, really. It's not like, technology isn't, it's not like there's a sliding scale from technologically primitive to technologically superior. And if there was, it wouldn't correspond one-to-one with which bracket of humans, can flourish in society, I don't think. Actually, I think that's something we can actually, you could probably plan for something like this. You could probably try to direct technological developments so that the world remains, habitable for everyone, so that everybody has, for instance, work. Everybody can like survive, and so that so that people who are good at I don't know software engineering or whatever the sort of favored skill set is aren't the only ones who can survive. And that's kind of we kind of have agency in that, some agency. I imagine easier said than done. All right, what other questions?
I return.
Welcome. I answered some questions.
Somebody Max Mercer has asked about Moldbug twice.
Oh, that's
I'll
for you.
get it out of the way quickly, because I don't think you read Moldbug at all. Did you watch the Distributus video on that?
Me?
Yeah.
Which one?
The long one, A Gentle Introduction to Mencius Moldbug.
I don't remember. If I did, it was really long ago and it didn't impact me at all.
Yeah, that was that was a long video. I think it was like 2 hours, 3 hours. I just very briefly, I haven't read deeply in Moldbug. I've read a little bit of him, and I just generally wasn't impressed. So my general take on Moldbug is, I mean, not a technical term, but this is sort of my issue. This is how I would determine what a crank is versus an actual theorist, is that they will emphasize system building over inquiry. So with the result that he'll take a bunch of these notions that are sort of very half-baked, and he'll lower the resolution to make them fit into each other, and then you'll have a very coherent narrative. Like by itself, you put that in a video game, you could make a whole story around that, very easy to write around. It simplifies things, but the problem is, by simplifying it, it dissolves a lot of particularity. And so, like, I find the notion of the cathedral, for example, I find it extraordinarily unhelpful. Not because it doesn't refer to something real, but because it refers to it in too broad a fashion. So he refers to the cathedral as a distributed conspiracy. It's not really a conspiracy, but the point is, it's sort of, it's almost what Marx would call a superstructure. So it's the ideological amalgamation of a society's institutions, and they are oriented in a particular way, so that certain things that aren't oriented that way get squeezed out. And that's, as a description, true, but it doesn't help you to identify that as a singular thing, because you aren't against that. The ways in which you relate to all of its parts is going to be radically different. And it also, by slicing the world into these two components, between the dissident and the cathedral, you're amputating the continuity between the two of you. Like reactionaries, for example, deploy a lot of the terms they receive through osmosis, or the concepts they receive through osmosis, via what they would call the cathedral. And it's simply incorrect to treat these things as if they were separate. And I'm sure he goes into more depth on this, but long story short, I just don't. I mean, Regal Esquire asks, is that necessarily the hallmark of a crank, but of an effective propagandist? They can. Well, I mean, the title's Sophistry. Do you want to talk about that?
Another tangent. Another good tangent I could talk
That's
for.
a really good tangent. I actually, you know what? Shruggie, take it away, please.
Oh, geez. Well, okay. So the topic is sophistry. I guess I have an interest in sophistry. So,
what is the Platonic definition of sophistry?
well, Plato, in his dialogues, he never defines sophistry. Socrates kind of makes some, he talks about, there's, so the person who can teach you wisdom, that's like a doctor for your body, right? Mm-hmm. So the sophist in comparison is like the pastry baker. So they're very good at making things that, just that are desirable, but that are not necessarily actually good for you. And I think there's a really striking excerpt that I'm going to find and read. Well, I hope I can find it. Oh no, I won't find it. I'll just say it, or I'll summarize.
Go for it.
Later in the Republic, Socrates likens basically crowds of people to like this sort of large lumbering, and the sophist is somebody who kind of like listens to the sounds it makes and knows just what it wants to hear when it wants to hear it, and it knows how to scratch its itches and tell it what it wants to hear right now. And like they just are good at maximally, like riding the crowd, like telling them what they want to hear and getting people to incidentally somehow happen to end up paying them money for advice. So basically, there's one character, the philosopher, and there's another character, the sophist, who tries to sell the things that the philosopher is working to get. And, so usually these, and yeah, this is not a phenomenon that only existed in ancient Greece. This is probably something that you can probably, with the description I just gave, I'm sure that something came to your mind from today when I was describing that kind of role. And again, I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure you will find such people on YouTube. And I'm
Tugs collar nervously.
They're probably making money.
Oh, well, there we go. So I'm off the hook.
You're not making any money.
Raw Coco asked an interesting question. So how do we perceive and identify sophistry?
Oh, how do we perceive and identify sophistry? Lord knows we have more sophists than sincere intellectuals. Yeah, in general in this world. Yeah, so that's the thing is, here's what the sophistry is good at. They're good at figuring out what wisdom looks like, what the superficial markers of wisdom are, right? So if somebody, in another text, Aristotle, not Plato, he has this work called the Sophistical Refutations, where he talks about, he says there are people to whom it is more profitable to appear to be wise than to actually play the function of a wise person. So these are people who, so here's an example. There are metallurgists or chemists who know about gold. They know about its chemical properties. They know how to identify it compared to other things. Here's another person with another skill set. They're very good at creating fool's gold. And the fool's gold they make is like really, he makes a lot of money because it's well executed fool's gold. So it's kind of like that with wisdom and this sophist character. The sophist is somebody who knows how to appear wise. And it's interesting, one of the ways to do that, one of these sort of sophistical refutations, as he calls them, is just when you're in an argument with somebody, to render the other person to babbling, right? So if you can set up questions or be, relentless enough or catch people off guard or use some clever trick, and the other person by comparison kind of gets knocked off their kilter, kind of can't get back in charge of things, what happens? Does that constitute a refutation, first of all? No, that's not a refutation at all. This is a social thing. It's like, look, that person is sputtering and that person isn't. But this is going to make the person who rendered the other person into this state of sputtering appear to be the one who knows what's going on, appear to be the one who you should listen to, who seems to know what they're talking about. So sophists, another thing about sophists is they're not going to, nobody who's actually after wisdom is going to be fooled by them because they're busy doing the actual work, going after the actual thing. And they can tell when something is spurious because they will try the things that these people say, just as they are constantly engaged in trying things in their own pursuit of wisdom. So how do we tell sophists from non-sophists? That's a great question. I would like a general theoretical answer to that. I wonder if, there are probably some signs. Oh,
I have a suggestion for a sign. One of the things that will almost, in my experience at least, that almost certainly points to somebody not being serious or being at some level fudging their knowledge will be the completeness of their account. If the account they give explains too much, be really wary. That's what I would say. And actually, sort of relevant to that, somebody asked.
I have some more ideas about that. Oh, sorry.
Please. No, I just wanted to comment on this quickly. Ernest von Schiepenheimer asks, what philosophers who are somewhat sophisticated, not Pinker or Rand, do you think push the limit between philosophers and cranks? Well, actually, as a matter of fact, Hannah Arendt, who massively influences me, absolutely brilliant political thinker, the tendency is for the narrative strength of her work to overpower sort of the particularity. So you have to be sort of careful with her. Very useful, very insightful, sometimes is a little bit too complete, if you get what I mean. Like the account she gives is a little bit too confident, and it's very powerful, very coherent. It goes a bit too far, and it doesn't particularize quite enough. So
I think humility is sometimes a good sign. Yeah, sorry, I'm just shooting more.
Oh, please.
Signs. Another thing to note is probably internal consistency over time is going to matter. I mean, people can obviously change their mind and acknowledge it, but so I mean, one way to tell what somebody is trying to do in general is to basically manipulate the parts of the world that you suspect they might be trying to interact with. Okay, that sounded really general, but what I mean is basically, if your goal is just to win an argument, then because we are these purposive creatures and we're good at this, we'll flexibly find any means to win the conversation, and we'll use them without regard to particularly what those means are. If that is our sole goal, then we will find whatever means are most expedient to that end, right? If our goal is not just to win a conversation, but for perhaps, I don't know, engage in a good faith sort of dialogue where you bring your considerations and your arguments and you listen to somebody else and you're willing to, give them a charitable shake, then, if you don't appear to win the argument, but you sort of continue to engage in that manner, I think that's at least an indication that what you're trying to do ultimately is not just win the conversation, because you will do things which do not actually conduce to you winning the conversation. Winning the conversation is a funny phrase.
Let us know at the end who won, by the way, chat. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Shall we continue?
I like these questions. I don't know why we're watching.
I don't want to either, but there were some doozies coming up, and I kind of want to see them.
Okay.
What do you think? Should we keep going with the video, or should we just chat?
Up to you. I mean, I don't really know what happens in this video, but
all right. Well, let's keep going. I'll tell you what. If it gets too dull, we'll just go back to questions at the chat, because I think those are really good. But,
sure. Yeah.
All
and
right.
We should probably pay attention to questions.
Oh, absolutely.
I like people asking questions.
I'm trying to. The problem is I have to. I only have one monitor, so I have to open up the tab to play the video. I guess I could just switch back and forth. I'll just double click. That's fine. Okay, but let's keep on going.
Okay.
But a liberal might say, look at the Dark Ages. They were pillaging and murdering each other back then. We aren't doing that anymore. Isn't that evidence that we're more advanced? It's true that we are less violent today than we were in the past, but that's because we're more advanced technologically, not ethically. Humans are creatures of nature, just like every other life form in existence. And their first and foremost purpose in life is to survive and to pass their genes onto a next generation.
Okay, can we pause?
Yeah.
All right. So is this a traditionalist?
This is a Darwinist.
Right. So yeah. I heard Darwin there. I didn't hear Aquinas. I didn't hear Aristotle.
Yeah.
What did he say the primary purpose of human existence?
The primary purpose is to reproduce, is to survive and pass on our genes.
Well, I mean, I mean, what?
When
did that idea arise? I mean,
in the Enlightenment.
I mean,
I think Darwin and John Stuart Mill were contemporaries. I think they both came after. They did both come after Kant. This is a progressive view of history, rendered in biological terms.
Interesting choice.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't. Yeah, what is there even to say? Let's keep going.
How difficult survival is will determine what measures must be taken in order to ensure that. In fact, I'd argue the purpose of civilization to begin with was to make survival easier. It was a lot easier to survive in a tribe than it was on your own, and it's much easier to survive in a settlement with industries than a nomadic tribe wandering the land. In the Middle Ages, it was common for one kingdom to invade another, pillage its land, and kill its people. But the reason they did this was not because they hadn't read Voltaire or because they had a monarch and not a democracy. It's because survival for them was much more difficult than it is today. Upholding their kingdom was essential to survival.
My history on this is fuzzy, but I have read quite a bit of Carl Schmitt and his account of European history from roughly early modern period until you get to people like Voltaire and whatnot, is that it was basically there hadn't been a war of annihilation for hundreds and hundreds of years, precisely because of sort of the Christian ideology of the place. Now, obviously, that's not an anti traditionalist argument, but I mean, no, people didn't go to war because survival was so difficult. People went to war as far back as ancient Greece because of ambition and because of ideology. Alexander the Great didn't make his massive conquests because Greece was hungry. This is
Don't we also not go to war now because we have nukes? I don't know. I'm not a political scientist, obviously.
Sorry, what was the question? You blanked out on my side.
I said, isn't another reason we don't go to war now that we have nukes? But I don't know anything when it comes to
yeah, I mean, that's true to an extent. We still do go to war. We just don't go to war with nuclear powers. So, I mean, in this respect, Endeavor is correct. So technology would actually prevent us from going to war to a certain extent because of the costs of technology. So, yeah. But anyways, let's keep going.
So if it meant going and destroying another competing kingdom, they would do it, or else it would be done to them. Now, that's not to glorify war, but to understand why it was necessary in the past. It's easy for us to look at the past and say they were barbarians. But in the modern world, we have no conception of how life actually was back then and what survival required.
Yeah, so the Schmittian notion of how we come to have wars of annihilation in the modern era is specifically because we started thinking in precisely the terms that Endeavor is thinking in now, because Europe had sort of a general Christian culture, and there's a general understanding between the different states that we'll fight and annex territories and whatnot, but we like this stable order. We like not having to be afraid of some great power like the Persian Empire in antiquity coming in and wiping us clean. The memory of the Islamic conquests is very much in everyone's memory as well. But when they go to the New World, they're now presented with this entire territory that has no such normative protections. And so when they engage in these kinds of wars of annihilation there, and when in more recent history, we started to see sort of the globalization of states like Europe as equivalent with Europe in the New World, this absence of sort of a normative assumption of you do not wage an existential war against your neighbor, more or less dissolved. And that's when you start to get Napoleon and World War I and Hitler and whatnot. So, I mean, it's, again, fuzzy, but this just doesn't ring true at all. And again, like, even in a much more primitive stage than the Middle Ages, wars are fought for gains. They're not fought because you need to fight wars to survive. You could put off war until the enemy was directly at your gates, and even then you could wait out a siege very easily. Like it was wars of annihilation were more common because political communities were inherently weaker. But it wasn't. Yeah, go on.
Oh, I was just reminded of something Hobbes said in Leviathan, where he's talking about another reason for conflict, in addition to just preemptive self-defense, is vainglory. People just want honor. They just want glory. They want the glory of just vanquishing people. Just basically pride. That's another reason people might go to war, is just because they think they're great and they want to be greater.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was the impetus for the Trojan War, even. right? Like when you actually, I mean, Thucydides gives a good account of this. The army of how am I losing his name? Agamemnon. Good God, the army of Agamemnon was effectively a pirate crew, right? Like they spent 10 years, mind you, according to legend, laying siege to Troy from an adjacent island, but they effectively just came in ships and just lived off of plunder for all that time. And the reason why people went was for glory. It wasn't because it was for glory and supposedly for vengeance against the kidnapping of Helen, but it was not because Argos needed Troy's resources. In fact, the legend is they razed Troy to the ground. So I mean, and not even like historical fame either, because there wasn't history then. Literally just for fame amongst the tribe back home. Like we did this, we brought back all these riches, aren't we so great? So this is just, and this is like 800 BC, wasn't it? I'm not sure, but yeah, this just doesn't work. And most of these wars of annihilation that you read about, like Hobbes, his point of reference was largely Greece in the time of Thucydides, because he actually translated Peloponnesian War, and somebody can correct me on that if they know of a different reference they would have been using there. But I mean, this was a time when you had these massive, very wealthy empires with these sprawling cities, waging war for reasons of vainglory, or because they were afraid of the growing hegemonic power of other cities, and they were afraid of being absorbed under their power, not for an existential reason. They didn't want to be made subject to another city. So this whole notion of political communities being like cells in the cell stage of spore, just eating each other and growing, like that doesn't make sense when you actually look at the history of these things. But let's keep going.
I almost feel a little bad because, I feel like this video isn't trying to, I mean, it's speaking in very broad strokes.
Yeah.
And I almost wonder if I shouldn't be faulting it for that. It makes me less interested in it, but I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, it is though. It's explicitly called the lies of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's strong language. But let's keep going, and maybe we'll just go back to questions after this, because this is tedious.
I missed questions, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thankfully today, we don't need to go off and kill each other for food. There are much more efficient survival strategies at our disposal. But to think that man has fundamentally changed is very dangerous. This first lie of the Enlightenment is cancerous for two major reasons. First of all, this narrative that we've become more enlightened over the past 3 centuries is a major contributor to Western guilt that we feel over our history. It suggests that the reason we were more violent in the past is because we lacked proper education, and that we just had liberalism back then, all this conflict would have been avoided.
Well, I mean, incidentally, something like the ending of slavery, that wasn't a technological innovation. That was helmed by Christians and enforced by liberals. So, for example, in 1834, the British government, they didn't just suddenly get rid of slaves. They had to transition, and they transitioned by making, I think it was like a 1 or a multi-year period where slaves would become indentured servants on their plantations, and then they would be free. And in the interim, they had to figure out, okay, how are we going to replace this labor? Because slaves formed an integral part of the economy. And so that's actually where you get, that's where the emergence of state borders comes from, because liberals were concerned that, okay, so you're moving in, we need to move in workers. So where do they get them from? Well, Britain sort of rules India at the moment. Which makes the Indians British subjects. We can bring in indentured contract labor from India to work on these plantations. And so liberals were very concerned, well, do these people understand, because there's a lot of illiteracy and whatnot, different language. It's a different place they're going to. They may not understand fully like what is entailed in these supposedly lucrative job opportunities overseas at these plantations. They may not. So the concern was, okay, so we're against slavery. We don't want these other people being taken advantage of and being used in the same way. How are we going to assure this is the case? Well, let's do this. Let's make them have to appear before a magistrate and convince the magistrate that they are doing this of their own free will. And so you have the first case of the regulation of migration within a territory, within the territory of a single sovereign. And I mean, long story short, technology didn't end slavery. It was entirely an ethical argument, and it flouted technology. It created a massive material burden, because now we suddenly had to replace this free labor force, not free in the sense of like having liberty, but free in the sense that we don't have to spend any money or much money on it by comparison, of this cheap labor force, and replace it with a much more expensive one with all these regulations that attend it. This was technologically backwards in a lot of ways. It would be much more lucrative just to keep using slaves.
Huh.
So yeah, and I mean, we also have things like workers' rights for the same reason. I mean, like there are things that unions can be criticized for, and things like that. But workers were treated terribly at one point. You could be beaten by your overseer at one point in the past. Like these aren't minor things. I would count this as a kind of ethical progress. Absolutely. Certainly, if you buy into a progressive notion that, well, not a progressive notion, but a Kantian notion that human beings should be treated as ends rather than means. And certainly, if you buy into the Christian notion that the two greatest commandments are to love your neighbor as yourself, and then the one above that is to love God. And then furthermore, loving God is largely described in terms of loving your neighbor. So when you give the poor person the cloak off your back, it is as if you were giving it to God himself. So I mean, that's just wrong. That's just absolutely wrong. The only reason why we have a differentiation between morality and customs is because, I mean, customs emerges according to practical use. Morality critiques that. And I mean, we go on, please.
Oh, you heard me inhale? Sorry.
Inhale.
I don't want to cut you off. But I mean, I certainly hope that in reactionary circles, the abolition of slavery is seen as a kind of moral progress. I know that the phrase moral progress is kind of something, they might have a negative kind of emotional thermometer towards. But I mean, to me, I think, I mean, I would be curious to know if anybody doesn't think that, because it seems pretty straightforward to me, but it seems like an instance of moral progress that there are not slaves, that you cannot own a slave. That seems like something that was never right. It seems like something Aristotle was wrong. It's not better for the slave to be enslaved. They don't have a different nature than the masters.
Well, he's specifically talking about natural slaves, so by definition has a nature different from the masters. So what you would dispute is that there are such people.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah.
I would dispute that there are such people.
Yeah. I mean, it's not saying that there aren't people with different skill sets and would not be better suited for like more manual labor, for example.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But we should pay them.
But the Aristotelian
they
logic,
should have their own houses. Sorry.
Yeah. But the Aristotelian logic is that these people are now basically a part of the mechanism of creating full people who are instantiated only within the household head, or within whatever you have, like the person at the top who is ultimately made able to spend the leisure time on self-growth.
Well, there's one sense in which technological progress and resulting economic prosperity is actually having a morally good outcome.
Yeah.
It's like, even if that were true, now it's no longer necessary, right? Well, I mean, for us, we're in Canada, so not necessary for Canadians. There are parts of the world where that is not yet true.
Yeah.
But you don't need. So for Aristotle, well, it was necessary that you had slave labor because that's the only way that the man of the house would have time to develop these intellectual capacities to read, to engage in public life. But I mean, that's just not a limitation that we have now. So at least that argument for slavery is, well,
sort of the idea that slavery is like it's a terrible thing, but it's at the very least. Well, I mean, it's not the very least, but it's nonetheless a requirement for allowing at least some of us to be fully human. Now, I would actually disagree with this.
Of course.
Yeah. Look, I think that's actually one of the. I mean, here's what's kind of curious about this. So Endeavor says here that we don't progress through education, but that's precisely how Europe became Christianized. I mean, there are cases as well where it was done by the sword, of course. But I mean, generally, this is the expansion of a textual culture, and originally a verbal culture. What did Christ do? He taught. He gave sermons. What did the apostles do? They wrote letters. They taught people. They argued with people. What did the philosophers do? Why do we have concepts like just war? Why do we have like these voluminous works on ethics that come about and are operated upon? Like when people talk about going back to Thomistic views of morality or traditional views of morality, do they realize how late these are? Compare medieval ethics to pre-Platonic ethics. Like it's night and day, and even within ancient Greece, like Plato represented a revolution in thinking. I mean, his whole notion of the philosopher versus the sophist. So we were talking about sophistry earlier. Sophists, I mean, we actually break down the word. Sophist seems to mean roughly what we tend to mean by philosopher today. Someone who engages in thought and trying to gain wisdom and understanding, what have you, through analysis and whatnot. He uses philosopher polemically. So in Aristophanes' Play the Clouds, which is a parody of Socrates, he refers to Socrates as one of the sophists. And in a technical sense, he was, because he was a teacher of wisdom, which is what a sophist is.
Well, I think there's a kind of pessimism where people become disillusioned with these people who are trying to sell wisdom. Yeah. So they kind of lump everyone in who says that they're after wisdom with the sophists. It's kind of like an inversion. Yeah. The sophists have a bad name, and so now the philosophers do by association, as opposed to the philosophers having a good name.
Well,
and so the sophists do.
Well, it's not the philosophers do by association. He's differentiating himself. He's saying that unlike the sophists, we don't just teach wisdom, we love wisdom. That's very, 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 it's a big distinction.
That's true. The philosopher is not primarily a person who teaches wisdom. They're a person seeking it.
Exactly. And incidentally, pursuant to that, somebody asked earlier, how do you determine, I think it was John Barron actually, distinguish the rhetorician from the sophist. Plato's Republic is full of logical, fallacious reasoning, but it's not meant to provide an argument. It's not simply a selection of arguments. It's itself a rhetorical teaching tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you used the phrase device the other day. For some reason, I like device more than tool.
I agree.
Because it's not like somebody uses it to the end of teaching somebody a lesson. It's you read it and it inducts you into philosophy.
Yeah.
Like that's one sort of magical property of that text is if you just read the Republic, just read it. You don't have to go to class or do all this extra secondary literature stuff. If you just encounter that text, if you just come to it and read it, you'll come out of that having been initiated into philosophy, basically. That's a strong claim, but I mean it.
No, I mean it doesn't just give you ideas. It orients your it's almost like it reorients your brain so you can think in modes that you couldn't before. Like it's a weird experience having read that for the first time. And which sounds kooky as all hell, but yeah.
Right. We're getting all kinds of comments.
Yeah, let's go to questions. I don't want to do any more of Endeavor. Are we okay with not doing Endeavor chat? I don't think anybody really wants to look at this anymore.
I mean, no offense, but I like the questions.
Yeah, I like the questions too. I'm on board with you there.
Okay. You should pick them. Because I don't know if I should be going way back to the start and then going from back to front or most recent. I have zero knowledge of how this works.
Yeah, did anybody have questions that they had up top that they want answered at this point? You just put them in at the bottom. We'll take a look.
Okay.
Anybody?
As for the distinction between rhetoricians and sophists, that's really, really obscure, if I remember correctly. In the Gorgias, Plato talks about that. Socrates talks about that. He has an analogy, which I don't remember, and it's one line, and it's not very illuminating. I don't have my notes with me here, but
if I may sort of interject, here's a really interesting question. It's sort of a nice bookend to what we've been talking about so far. Are there any downsides to modernity?
Modernity. Well, what do we mean? Architecture?
That's a good question.
That was a cheap shot.
This is Mike who's asking that, by the way. Are there downsides to modernity? I mean, of course there are. Modernity is, first of all, is very broad, but let's just say in general, are there problems in sort of the general ways in which people today conceive the world? Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, there's a reason why people are still doing philosophy. It's because they aren't satisfied with how people are thinking now.
Yeah. Have we ever figured out how to do like pluralist societies? Have we ever figured out how to deal with the fact that there are just disparate religious traditions, cultural heritages? Have we ever figured out how to coexist in a nation in a way that everybody's happy with? I don't think we've figured that out.
Cameron Gilchrist just asked me, do you agree that Greek philosophical development was a necessary precursor to the rise of Christianity? Yes, but I want to be careful here. Greek philosophical development, I mean, to a certain extent, a lot of this is shrouded in mystery. It's hard to say to what extent any individual writer in the New Testament, for example, was influenced by Greek philosophical thinking. They almost certainly were to a certain extent. The main thing is that the form of the Roman Empire that permitted the rise of Christianity, and again, my history here isn't perfect, but there are moments in the history of Rome that led to that were very much a product of Greek philosophical thinking. For example, the divisions between the different parts of society and their conceptions of religion. I go into this in my video, What is Religion? Were largely inventions by educated Romans, specifically Cicero, as well as concepts of authority, what have you. And these were taken from largely their education in Greek philosophy. I don't want to be too bold with that because my history there isn't excellent.
But if I could maybe push back a little bit, there might be things about the development of Christianity that were prefigured by sort of Greek context. Certainly, as people are trying to figure out all of these theological issues. But I do think that there are some kind of novel aspects of Christianity which seem to have originated with, things that you hear Jesus say in the Gospels, for instance. I think there are some genuinely new ideas in there. Like I mentioned before, this notion of agape, which is quite a divergence from the ways that the Greeks thought of love and what love was. So, I think there are at least some novelties to it, which, it'd be fun to do some sort of science fiction and like imagine that there was, that this took place in some other cultural context. But anyways, that's all I had to say there.
Okay. I'm going to have to disappear for another 5 seconds. I'll be right back. You just want to keep on doing what you're doing?
Questions? Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So now people are... how would you define and distinguish modernity from postmodernity? I should wait for Sunday for that. I imagine he has more to say. I'm not sure what I would say. I would give a lame answer about, the periods. Like, well, modernity ended at a certain time and postmodernity started at a certain time. I'm gonna defer that one. Do I watch Westworld, and what do I think of the AI in it? Every time I say that I work on AI, and every time I talk about these topics, people ask me if I have seen some show on Netflix or some, science fiction that has AI in it, and I'm ashamed. I almost always have to answer no. I don't have any time. I'm a busy grad student, and I'm doing a lot of reading, but I haven't watched a show. When was the last time I watched a show? I think I watched Lost. Does anyone remember Lost? I don't even remember when that was. Netflix was new. Um, so the answer is no, but I would like to acquaint myself with, you know, because that's the only place that this big AI project is discussed, and that's where it enters into the imagination. And it is in the popular imagination, the idea that you can create beings that are like us. And yeah, so the only people who discuss that, they're science fiction writers. They're not people in the discipline that is called AI. You don't see discourse about that sort of thing in those journals. Sunday, you're back?
I am back indeed. That was really interesting. Sorry, I just want to interrupt.
I brought up a question and said I couldn't answer it, and I should wait for you.
That was modernity and postmodernity.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you distinguish modernity from postmodernity? Oh, she says it twice. Okay. So, I mean, if you want to be technical about it, modernity, like modern, really just means contemporary, like what's happening now, most recent iteration. What I generally take to be postmodern, I mean, postmodernity, modern and postmodern refer to a huge different range of things, in architecture and philosophy and politics, what have you. So there isn't really one single definition. How I generally understand it is that modernity takes, when we say something is modern, we tend to mean, in sort of a naive sense, this is the state of how things are. Like this is how things are now. And postmodernity is taking that and critiquing it and saying, is this in fact how things are now? So for example, there's a confidence in a lot of modern philosophy. Like modern philosophy, what's called modern philosophy goes back to Machiavelli. Modernity is in philosophical terms is very old. And there's this confidence through it out that we can describe the world in these certain terms. And then postmodernity in philosophy and political theory tends to mean something along the lines of, well, hang on, let's just look at these a little bit more carefully. You have this concept that plays an integral role in your theory about how history works or how progress works or what have you. Do you know where this comes from? Because this in itself could have happened differently. And I'm not explaining this well, but what that generally entails is that, well, this theory doesn't essentially describe reality. It describes how we came to think about things given certain contingent historical facts. And a lot of people tend to associate postmodernism with sort of a general relativism as a result. And certain people polemically do assume that as well. So there will be people who say something is just a social construct. And that's unhelpful. Nothing is just a social construct. Social constructs can be as real as anything else. Social relationships are real. And there are real things in the world that rely upon social relations to manifest. Marriage is a social construct. Marriages exist. What a thing being a social construct means, especially if there are sort of historically contingent ideas in its conception, it means that we don't need to treat these things as necessary parts of the landscape. We can go back and say, maybe this thing isn't necessary. And it's only maybe not necessary. Problematizing it in that way doesn't necessarily mean you throw it out. It just means, like, for example, well, like when you talk about human nature, like the Endeavor here talked about human nature, human purpose being to survive and propagate our genes. That view came about as, I mean, it was largely a critique, wasn't it? It's functionally a critique of the view of humanity as essentially having these qualities that we associate with the Old and the New Testament. Human beings were created to serve the Creator or some such. The Augustinian idea that in nature before sin, the human body below the neck was subordinate to the reason. Right? So if you make if you go back and you say, actually, from our study of human biology and its relationship to animal biology, and there is one we propose, we actually see that far from being separate from far from our biological urges and our animal nature being the product of sin, it's actually a necessary component in our development. And without it, we wouldn't be the way we are and have all of these sort of divine attributes we want to attribute specifically to creation. Now, that's not an argument against creation either per se, but it's exactly that kind of thing. So,
well, I mean,
go on,
that
please.
idea that the sort of, what do I want to call them? The things that are not reason, the sort of animal aspects of ourselves kind of prefigure the reasoning aspects of ourselves. Yes,
that's well put.
That is expressed in a provocative way in Darwin, but that also is an idea that Aristotle has. And indeed, you know, even medieval philosophy, like that idea has had currency most of the time.
Well, I was going to say, actually, gender roles are a good example of this as well. So there's the idea in Aristotle, for example, that the role of women in the household is to do the household work. And there's a general expectation that they can't attain the same range of virtues as men. And that's why the eudaimon is never a woman. The woman is a part of the process of producing the eudaimon. Eudaimon meaning sort of the good-spirited man, the flourishing man, the full human being. But this isn't actually a part of human nature per se, because we see today that there are actually in Greek society, in ancient Athenian society, men married women many years their junior who were not given education. And so, of course, you would expect your wives to be not quite as intelligent or learned as you because they were uneducated children. It's just like, surprise. And so to then take that into the present and say, well, that is something that we should return to. Well, I mean, that's assuming a lot. And if in fact there are contingent factors that produce that reality, as indeed there are, then you shouldn't take that as essentially a part of human nature, of sort of the subservience of one sex to the other. Now, it's more complicated than that, of course, but that's just one way in which you could go about it. That's just an example of how I guess that would be a postmodern critique, but I mean, it's also a critique levied by Plato, so it's, I don't know. That's more geared towards social construction than anything.
Should we do another question?
Yeah, we should do another question. Sorry, I'm meandering here. My caffeine high is starting to wane. Excuse me. So,
okay.
Leotard defined the postmodern as an incredulity towards all meta narratives. That's a good way of putting it.
Some more questions about Netflix shows.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, Black Mirror and what's it? Sorry, let me just move back. Blade Runner, right? Blade Runner. Blade Runner is a classic sci-fi hit. Sorry, I guess I wasn't very impressed by Blade Runner. I didn't think it was. I don't even like the aesthetic.
Did you see the sequel?
I don't even like cyberpunk. Like, it's mostly dumb. It's mostly just not executed in a compelling way. It's just like unaesthetic in uncreative ways. I mean,
I would push back a little bit, if I may.
You may.
So early cyberpunk is actually very creative. It was doing something not dissimilar to what Orwell was doing with 1984, in that it's taking aspects of sort of the present reality in which they were writing and sort of extrapolating how these will appear in the future taken to extremes. And so you end up with these often very horrible super capitalistic societies in which human beings have been reduced to largely almost a slave status. So you have so like they're interesting for that reason, and largely the questions that they approach have to do with things like freedom, or notions of freedom and identity in a world in which sort of barriers between people are constantly being intruded upon, in which people increasingly have less and less scope for free action, because you're living amongst this massively accumulating machinery of state around you, of state and industry around you that no human being can comprehend, let alone control, because there are these mass processes going on. And yeah, in a certain sense, that is what we have now. It's an exaggeration of present conditions.
Probably cyberpunk is probably going to be more interesting from a political angle. As somebody who like studies artificial intelligence and like the ethics of artificial intelligence, so Blade Runner, what was the premise with those robots? Okay, so they were like super powerful, super smart. They died early, but they didn't have empathy. They were.
Hang on. I don't think that's true. No. They did have empathy. That was one of the points, is that the replicants were actually basically human. Like at the end of it.
Well, what were those tests designed to assess when they were trying to look for some kind of emotional reaction?
A lack of empathy, but Deckard himself, in certain interpretations of the film, is himself a replicant, and he demonstrates empathy. Roy Batty demonstrates empathy. He saves Deckard at the end for no apparent reason. Deckard's trying to kill him. He sees him struggling, and he expresses a sentence that implies empathy. Specifically, he says, he looks Deckard in the eye as he's hanging onto the cliff, and he says, "Quite an experience to live in fear, isn't it?" It's explicitly an empathetic statement. He is saying, I feel what you are feeling, or you are feeling what I am feeling. So I was going to say,
so psychopaths are people who don't have this instinctive empathy. They can say things like that to deke people out too, because they know how empathetic people work.
But they don't save you afterwards for no reason.
Sorry?
They don't save you afterwards. What distinguishes him from a sociopath or a psychopath is that Roy Batty then saved him for no reason.
Yeah, but I just think, like, so how is it the case that everybody, the police force, the creators of these robots, is under that illusion then? Like, how could somebody who was able to pull off designing something that was like us in every respect, including apparently empathy, not think that they had succeeded in replicating empathy? I just don't think empathy is like, you can't have a human, I don't know. I think I'm going to contradict myself when I just said that psychopaths don't experience empathy, but
well, I think
I just critiqued myself pretty well.
Well, I think there's an obvious explanation for that, though. It's just general indifference. People have jobs that rely on the assumption of these things not having empathy. So the Blade Runners and the Void Comp tests and all of that. I mean, we see this today. There are people, like, knowledge doesn't necessarily accrue neutrally. People are invested in their theories and in the ascendancy of certain theories, so that they have the role in society and the goods that come therefrom, by those things being where they are. So, I mean, it's absolutely possible that people are just indifferent because there's a material benefit in simply not scrutinizing that. Right?
I was going to just concede right now that I'm expressing an irrational dislike for Blade Runner. I watched it recently. I don't know. There's kind of this trope you see that, we could create beings that were intelligent and this is in like 3 quotation marks, rational, logical, but we couldn't create beings that are emotional. That is inscrutable. That is inexplicable. Whereas, we could make something that was triple quote logical.
I was going to say, though, just to jump to the defense of sort of classic cyberpunk. So the initial emergence of cyberpunk is like that. After the initial run of cyberpunk novels came out, now people were imitating the aesthetic of them because it was successful. And so a lot of modern cyberpunk is precisely that. It's imitating the appearance, completely divorced from the critiques that were that informed the emergence of the aesthetic.
I guess I'm just typically like, I just have this revulsion when AI is used as like a major sort of plot device, but it's just so like naive as a theory about what AI would have to be. Like, it's not coming from a, and of course it's not. Of course, the people writing these novels are not, you know, thinking about the problem from a technical or from a design perspective. But
I'd say some
for
are.
me, that just kills it. I don't know why. It's like I guess if it's like if you're watching Star Trek and they're talking about warp drive or something, and you're somebody who does like, I don't know, space engineering or something. You're a rocket scientist and you're watching that and you're listening to Scotty talk about, you know, not having enough dilithium crystals or something.
Yeah.
I probably just am experiencing that and not being fair. And also I haven't, like I said, I haven't watched a lot of things. So there's my list of disclaimers. I'm sorry if I was unfair to cyberpunk. Yeah. Ooh, a question for me. How do epiphenomenalist claims fit into your view of AI personhood? Okay, so I think that epiphenomenalism is false. I think it's a false thesis about, well,
Do you want to explain maybe what that is for people who don't know?
right. It's hard to explain it without prejudicing the issue. Okay, so epiphenomenalism is the idea, roughly, that, okay, so, you know, we're these embodied beings, we have brains, but we also think we also have conscious experiences, we have subjective experiences, we're aware of things, and then we have things we call mental states, beliefs and desires and intentions. So what people have thought is really hard to explain, is really problematic, is what's the relation between these mental things, subjective experience, awareness, desire, belief, intention, and physical things. These seem like different categories. So how do we understand the relation between the physical and mental things? So epiphenomenalism is the view that, okay, well, we're not going to say that we don't have subjective experience or any of these other things, but these things are not physical. These are distinct from physical things. These are distinct from brain events, brain activities. So they're there, but they can't cause anything. So they're out of the causal order. They kind of come along for the ride. So the brain is this causal machine doing things, and yeah, you're aware while it's doing stuff, and it seems like you have intentions, and you are responsible for the things that you do. But that's just kind of an illusion that gets generated as an inessential byproduct. So it exists, but it doesn't have any role in the sort of causal constitution of ourselves or in our behavior. That's what epiphenomenalism is. Now let me just circle back to the question. How do epiphenomenalist claims fit into my view of AI personhood? Right. So I don't think that's true in the human case. I don't think epiphenomenalism is true for us. So I don't think it would be true for an artificial person either. Okay, so I'm going to introduce another term. So some people are eliminativists. They think that there is no conscious experience. There are no beliefs, desires, and intentions. These just don't exist. Maybe they're false theoretical constructs. Like we're looking at people acting, and we're trying to infer the hidden causes of their behavior. And the best idea of a mechanism we could come up with are things like beliefs and desires and intentions and subjective experience. But that's false. That's folk science. It's just a false theory, like phlogiston or something. So that's eliminativism. I am not an eliminativist. I'm a realist. I think there are beliefs. I think there are desires. I think we are aware of things. I think we have subjective experience. And I think that, so very briefly, here is the relation I think the mental has with the physical. I kind of find that distinction, okay, so I haven't quite actually come down on this yet.
Well,
but
what is meant by physical in this case? Is the suggestion that, I mean, obviously there's the Cartesian implication here, but is the suggestion that mental activity doesn't exist in the world? Like the mind ultimately isn't related to stuff? And why would that be a problem if it was? Like, what exactly is wrong with stuff? I mean, it can't even translate into, like, if you think about it, one of the reasons why this is there's a lot of motivation to dissociate the mind from the material world. So the material world is the world of change. And so if you associate the mind with physical material, you lose all of these things that religious people value. So the immortality of the soul, things like that. But like, just to sort of follow through this thought really quickly, the religious perception of stuff is that it was created by God, just like whatever this other substance is that is mind. Why would that make you more vulnerable?
I mean, sure, but I don't see why we should think there are two substances in the first place.
I agree.
So, like, I think, yes, we have a set of kind of mental vocabulary for describing things. Yes, we have a set of vocabulary for describing what brains do, which is a different set of vocabulary, and we don't have reason to think that those terms will line up one-to-one. So basically what I think is, when we actually figure out, when we actually make progress on neuroscience, what we're going to do is we're going to explain how it is possible that we're aware of things. And the brain is obviously important for that, but also you're going to have to talk about the whole situated organism. You're going to have to talk about, so if we're trying to explain how we have, like, how I'm aware of this live stream, how I'm aware of this computer in front of me, neuroscience is going to, like, sorry, how do I put this? Okay. Here's a different way to put it. Whatever the right physical story is, the descriptive vocabulary is not actually going to diverge from the mentalistic one. So in other words, there are beliefs, there are desires, there are intentions, we are aware of things. Neuroscience is going to show us how and what that looks like, how that's instantiated. I'm sure there are, yeah.
I'm just going to answer a question addressed to me. Hang on, let me make sure it's addressed to me. Here we go. So the last man asks, will genetic engineering render the obsession with race and intelligence irrelevant or accelerate it? I'm actually going to let you answer that as well, but I think both. I think it's going to do a couple of things. First, it's going to break down the sort of stereotypical racial categories that we've inherited so far. And it's going to break down because there's now going to be a new group of people who are genetically engineered versus people who aren't. And that's going to end up being the primary distinction. I'm projecting. I'm assuming. I mean, I have no idea, but this is what I would guess at. I don't think the obsession that you see in certain sectors with sort of currently accepted racial divisions will proceed as much, at least not in areas where genetic engineering is the norm, if it ever becomes the norm, which I mean it sort of is already in a certain extent. But yeah, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Shruggie?
I think, I mean, when you were gone, somebody asked, what do you think about race and IQ? And I said, I don't care. Will genetic engineering render the obsession with race and intelligence irrelevant? Probably not. Look, people are going to be obsessed with that. I don't know why they're obsessed with it now. I don't understand how this innovation will remove this desire to care about that topic.
Well, when you listened to Endeavor talk about it, and when I was talking to the distributors a little while ago, they regard, for example, I know the distributors regards sort of affirmative action as racial vengeance and a kind of as a destructive thing for the reason. Well, for the reason basically that it promotes sort of lower IQ groups into stations of administrative authority, let's say, something like that, or just higher up in a vague sense. And as a result, this will cause a general decline in just the functioning of civilization and things like that. And so, I mean, generally, I interpret the obsession is it's a low entry way to diagnose the problems of the modern world. What's something that's going on right now? Oh, there's a lot of immigration. We can attribute all of our problems to immigration. There's all these low IQ barbarians out there. We're assuming they're low IQ barbarians out there coming in, and it's like, look, okay, so here's my thoughts on the race and IQ thing. So the data shows that, according to sort of accepted racial divisions, that there are IQ differences contemporaneously. Now, the problem is that that's all it tells you. The data doesn't take into account the myriad factors that contribute to. Here's the crucial point too. Not to being intelligent, but to scoring well on IQ tests. So you would expect, for example, poverty is often brought up, but you need to think about what that means. Being in poverty means you are typically less nourished than someone who is not in poverty. It means you have less space and less leisure than someone who is not in poverty. Like, for example, Shruggie here just was mentioning earlier about how, as a grad student, he had no time to watch movies because he was reading all the time. What if you have no time to read because you're working all the time? Yeah. So here's what I think. If you were able, under perfect circumstances, to just have everyone start off from the same place, magically, as if they had been born as they are now, without history. Like, just pretend this yeah, it's an impossible scenario, but have everyone born and raised under identical circumstances with identical goods, what have you, you will find discrepancies in IQ outcomes based on those tests. Absolutely. We don't know what those will be. We'll never know what those will be. And they're almost certainly not going to, and this is what David Reich points out, who is, by the way, a race realist of sorts, in his book, Who We Are and How We Got Here. I think he's a geneticist, but this is what he points out. It's like, look, there will be differences, and there will likely be genetic contributions to those differences. Maybe they'll be more or less important, but they are not going to track our racial divisions now. And for a number of obvious reasons. Racial divisions now largely correspond as well to economic and political realities and political differences. So it will correspond to where you are. It will correspond to how your society treats you. It will correspond to sort of what your family's history is like. So, for example, if you're malnourished and you're overworked and you're poorly educated as a result, and all of these different things, and you're tired and underslept, that's going to carry over not just into whether or not you succeed personally. That will carry into how you raise your kids and to the culture surrounding them, and it has like it perpetuates. Now, it's just largely irrelevant. It's a giant red herring. It completely obfuscates the problem of people being deprived of conditions that will actually allow them to fully actualize as human beings and maximize their potential. Like, we're not seeing people having maximized their potential and saying we've identified classes of individuals based on what they can ultimately do under ideal conditions. We're looking at people under very unideal and very asymmetrical conditions and then saying, oh, see, that's how these people are in nature. It's like, no, no, you haven't observed these people in nature. Any of them. Even going back to ancient Greece, you haven't observed them in nature. And furthermore, there's something else too, sort of connected to this. A lot of people in this stream, not in this stream personally, but in this line of thought. I know Distributus is like this. Stefan Molyneux is like this. A whole bunch of them, and they'll say something to the effect of like, "White people developed all of these cultural goods we recognize today." Yes, they did, to a certain extent. But this again, you can't downplay the historical aspect here. And these were very few people over a very small span of time, very late in our history. Civilizations existed long before ancient Athens. This was one locale among several, by the way. It's not just there, but largely we draw our heritage from there. And this was one locale that developed philosophical thinking and scientific thinking and whatnot, and all these awesome things, only after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they had to be dragged kicking and screaming. Okay, just remember, Socrates was executed. He was not embraced because of the just inherent intelligence of Athenians. And even then, people like the gender thing. People were only given the general leisure and whatnot to think about these things as a result of their historical position and geographic location. Thucydides goes into this. One of the advantages Athens had early on was that the soil was barren, and they were on the coast, so they had access to ideas and goods and whatnot over vast differences, and were largely not subject to attack until they became sort of an economic hub. So, like, yeah, it's largely irrelevant, and bluntly, nobody who has actually moved Western culture forward, if you want to call it that, just for brevity's sake, has accepted that premise. As far as I'm aware, it would certainly be a very tiny minority. So it's not the high IQ position to take. Basically.
Well, I like the Stephen Hawking quote that only losers care about IQ. I don't know.
Yeah.
People seem so like, they're like, oh yeah, IQ is this. It means something very definite and concrete and important. I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit less, psychology isn't exactly in a state where, well, it's not even psychology's fault. It's just like, what is IQ precisely, and why is it important? That's a good question to ask. It's not one with a straightforward answer to me.
Yeah. If I just want to, Evening Star made a good point. So Sunday, the point isn't that it was produced by a small number of people, referring to just, I guess, philosophy and Western culture generally. The point is that, that doesn't change the fact that they emerged where they did. No, it doesn't, but you can't downplay the where they emerged part of that equation. That's the crucial point. The question is, was it inherent in their genes, or were there other factors involved? And of course, like, to a certain extent, genetics will influence your ability to learn. Like that's true, but it will not determine your outcome. It is one ingredient among many, and like, if you lack leisure, if you lack safety, if you lack nutrition, I mean, this is what Hobbes points out. There is no civilization in a state of nature, or in a state of war, which he equates with a state of nature. And so one of the reasons why, here's another crucial point, right? Yes, it is very important. It is very important that Socrates emerged where he did. And where he emerged was at the tail end of a long series of political reforms that were emergent from basically class struggle that made it possible for the average person to have a level of security and autonomy in society such that they could think and have discourses with each other. And it caused like an emphasis of discourse in their culture. So philosophy itself is as emergent from material factors as from the genius of any individuals. It's certainly not emergent from genes. Certainly not an exclusion, I should say. I don't want to downplay the role of genes. Genes probably do play a role. In fact, of course they play a role. It'd be stupid not to. But
a lot of people,
as Hjalmar Bayron says, people aren't bright, and we're so prone to error that our thinking is characterized by it. Yeah, I mean, look, it's just worth pointing out that even amongst geniuses like Aristotle and Plato, they recognize from their own experience, from talking to the best people in their cultures, that if you lacked a good education, if you lacked certain material factors, you would not become a philosopher, or you wouldn't be able to think properly. Like, there would be barriers there. Please, Shruggie, I interrupted you. Continue.
Oh, well, one of the things that some have argued is distinctive about human beings as opposed to other social and even political animals.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I guess I'm thinking of a guy called Vygotsky in particular. He says, Well, one of the differences that we have is the ways that we're capable of cultural transmission. So, like, humans have very long periods of development. We have this long period of childhood, and we're exposed to kind of completed forms of capacities that we are just starting to develop because of our parents, or through our parents, through the people around us, through the social institutions and just cultural artifacts. And why am I talking about this? There's a reason. You were talking about the material conditions and how this is like a decisive factor in what somebody's IQ score ends up being. So the obvious difference is, people who are raised in different conditions are not exposed to the same, to use teleological language, they're not exposed to the same kind of endpoint. They don't have the same scaffolding, is what I'm saying. They're not going to end up at the same endpoint. That's probably obvious.
Well, Evening Star suggests he has a couple of interesting things to say here, so I'm just going to read them out quickly. So, right, I'm assuming he's responding to me, but the certain extent, quote unquote, of genetic influence that you speak of is a crucial limiting factor, and one which is downplayed radically today. I see it like this: genetics determines the absolute potential of an individual's abilities. If a population doesn't have certain capabilities, it will not produce people of that type. Yes, acculturation is intimately linked to genetic evolution. So we can, there isn't nothing to this. So it is perfectly possible for genes to represent a limitation on a person's abilities. Like, we know this with other aspects of your bodies as well. And it is in fact downplayed by some people as a complete non-factor. And scientifically, this isn't true, but the question isn't whether or not genes play a role. The question is whether they are decisive. So of course, if you are genetically, and I have no idea how you would, it's like, okay, fine. So genes do play a role. Let's accept that as a given. And that is radically downplayed today. The answer to that is not to say, no, it's entirely the opposite direction. Genes are the only thing that do it. And so he says acculturation is intimately linked to genetic evolution. How do you determine that? Like, what are we observing here to determine this? That doesn't make sense.
I'm not sure what it means. Like, I'm trying to parse the sentence.
I'm assuming acculturation means like the ability to absorb new ways of thinking. So therefore the ability of certain intellectual developments to have uptake in a society.
Well, so I mean, and the selection pressures in a society are going to be different, or the selection pressures across societies are going to be different. Is that maybe what is meant? I don't know. I kind of just wonder what the import of all of this is. Like, I don't know.
Well, the import is that it's a substitute for political theory, essentially. So in order to have a good society, we don't need to just arrange society in a particular way. We need to arrange it with the right people. So I disagree with this categorically, and not because I have a bias against genes as a means of analysis, but because I've read political history, and what you see is like these, like, you don't need to know history completely to understand sort of the fact that there are particular moments that were required for certain following moments to occur. So you can't have philosophy without the emergence of particular reforms in Greece that were themselves the emergence of unconscious pressures that emerged from economics. And those economic pressures emerged from the particular place they happen to be in space and time. Full stop. So if you have that missing, and so lacking that in other places, you wouldn't expect the same developments. And like, there's a million different things that can prohibit this from emerging as well. So if you're in a culture, if you're in a location where the majority of people lack leisure and time and nutrition and all these little things that would allow for a sort of intellectual development of a particular kind to occur, to go fast, or like to accelerate, then somebody who's then almost by definition, someone who does come up with, who does have a vibrant intellectual life and does make intellectual progress, so to speak, they would be an outgroup.
If I could just interrupt quickly,
Please.
I have a Zoom meeting.
Oh, okay.
At 5.
We've been here for almost 2 hours.
A little bit late for, but
well, I'll tell you what. We've been here for almost 2 hours. Let's wrap it up, and I would love to have you on again. I think this was really good.
Yeah, this was fun. Let's do it again.
Yeah. All right. So,
can we end on a note that is unrelated to that topic?
Please, yes.
Okay. I didn't say I had one. I just said, what a way to. That's like dying with the whimper. I feel like we started.
All right. Well, maybe we should bring it back to topic.
Sure. Right. So, what was the title of this stream? It was How Reactionaries.
No. It was. Oh shoot! Modernity and Reactionary Sophistry.
Ah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about modernity. We talked a lot about reactionaries. We talked about sophistry. That's good.
Yeah. Here's a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Are modern reactionaries sophists?
Only the ones that are sophists.
Okay, so the answer to that question.
Sorry. I don't know. I think it's worth saying something in plain daylight. Reactionaries are, well, reactionaries, right? Their identity is wrapped up with a kind of pushback to something.
Yeah.
That's a thing worth saying. Yeah, I think I'm running out of steam here, obviously.
That's okay. Well, you're on a deadline too. Don't feel like you have to cap this off in some poetic way. We're going to have you back on, absolutely. And I think there's definitely interest in hearing more from you on artificial intelligence and on philosophy and things like that.
I'd love to.
Yeah. So we'll definitely schedule that for the future. Thank you for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Take care.
Enjoy your lives.